Welcome everyone to this installment of the Chinese Business webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. I'm Ghassan Moazin. I'm an assistant professor here at the Institute, and I'm today also joined by my colleague and co-convener of the webinar, Dr. John Wong. Today, we are very happy to welcome to the webinar Dr. Covell Meyskens. Covell received his PhD from the University of Chicago and is now an assistant professor of Chinese history at the Naval Postgraduate School. And we are very fortunate to have him talk to us today about his a recent book, Mao's Third Front, The Militarization of Cold War China, which came out in 2020 with Cambridge University Press and has been very well received. So we're looking forward very much to his talk. Before I hand over things to Covell, I should say a few things about the format of the talk. So Covell is going to talk for around 30 minutes, and then we'll have roughly 30 minutes for questions and answers. The format of the talk is a webinar. So if you have any questions for Covell, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I'll read them then out during the Q&A part of the talk, and Covell can then reply to you during the Q&A. And you're welcome to actually already start posting or submitting questions through Q&A during the talk itself, if you want to. We'll be having a look at that. So without further ado, I hand over things to you, Covell.
All right, first off, just like to thank a lot for having me here today to give this talk. Obviously wish it was in Hong Kong, but instead I'm coming to you live from my garage. So let's just get started. Get the PowerPoint already. All right, so the PowerPoint looks fine and everything?
All very good, yeah.
All right. So on May 27th, 1964, Mao Zedong summoned Deng Xiaoping and a few other Chinese Communist Party leaders to discuss China's third five-year plan. Over the past few months, Deng and other leading officials had drafted initial plans which concentrated on developing coastal areas and lifting the output of agricultural and consumer goods. Mao disapproved of this economic strategy because it did not address China's worsening geopolitical environment. The United States had a string of military bases around China from South Korea to the Philippines, and Washington was expanding its forward deployed forces in Southeast Asia. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had transformed in the wake of the Sino-Soviet split from a close ally into a major security threat with 200,000 troops on China's northern border. What made matters worse was both the United States and Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear weapons, while China did not even have a single atomic bomb, as the Soviet Union had withdrawn its promise to help China build one. Given China's imperiled international security position, Mao argued that in the age of the atom bomb, not having a military rear was no good. In preparation for war, the party had to divide the country into three military fronts, which you can see in the map here on the left. There was a first front along the coast, in the northeast and in the far west, a second front behind coastal provinces, and a third front in central China. In this final region, the party had to secretly build a large military industrial complex called the Big Third Front to serve as a backup economic motor for national defense in case the Americans or Soviets invaded. And the party had to abandon established industrial areas and retreat into the interior like Chiang Kai-shek had done during World War II, and also like Stalin had done during World War II as well. Provinces in the first and second front also had to build small industrial bases named the Small Third Front, which you can see over here in the map on the right. Now, these are all the small third front complexes that I had located as of a few years ago when I came up with this map. So like the CCP's revolutionary base areas, all third front projects had to be dispersed in hidden mountain locations. With this new industrial war machine, Beijing would be in a better position to fight off an assault by its Cold War enemies. Between 1964 and 1980, China dedicated about 40% of the national capital construction budget to building this arsenal of Chinese socialism, all while keeping the project completely secret, because like other Cold War statesmen exposed to the heat of intense geopolitical friction, Chinese leaders presumed that whatever was publicly perceptible was militarily vulnerable. There's much that can be said about the Third Front. Today, I'll concentrate my talk on a few major issues. First, I'll examine what party leaders initially thought of Mao's proposal to launch the Third Front. Next, I will discuss UCP efforts to socially engineer a new Maoist person that embraced an austere life of hard work, but put building socialism before familial concerns, and took wherever the party sent them to be their home. I will assess what the builders of the Third Front made of Maoist standards of conduct by first looking at how the party mobilized labor and how people responded to recruitment. Then I will go over the different meanings that people ascribe to the Spartan conditions of everyday life in the Third Front. Finally, I will close my talk with a few comments about the Third Front's social, economic, and political afterlives. When Mao first proposed building the Third Front in May 1964 in China's inland regions, Deng Xiaoping and other top party leaders did not immediately back Mao's call to undertake a big developmental drive to bolster national security. They instead recommended conducting preparatory surveys and drawing up plans for a few select projects. This policy stance was based on their preference for focusing on coastal development, agriculture, and light industry, as well as their concern that Mao was seeking to launch an industrialization campaign like the Great Leap Forward. During the Great Leap, the central government had decentralized authority to localities and commanded them to mass mobilize local resources to quickly expand China's industrial base. In the end, the Great Leap had led to economic and administrative disorder and a famine that killed tens of millions. Party elites only endorsed building the Third Front in August 1964, when the United States bombarded North Vietnam in the wake of the Tonkin Gulf incident. Faced with the prospect of a great power war, party leaders greenlighted the construction of a military-industrial complex in inland regions. To ensure that the Third Front campaign did not experience the Great Leap Forward's managerial problems, party leaders granted central planners sole authority over its administration, did not allow our local leaders to independently initiate projects, and repeatedly reminded areas with Third Front projects to pay due attention to agricultural production. Integral to the Third Front's construction was a huge labor force. In total, roughly 15 million people took part in the campaign, with about 1 million laborers coming from urban areas and another 14 million being mobilized from the countryside. Since the Third Front was top secret, its creation was never officially announced. It only actually appeared in the People's Daily in 1978. It was only through reading classified party documents that local officials became aware of its existence. In late 1964, leading party organs began to send out documents about the Third Front, commanding provincial and municipal officials to help establish a powerful strategic barrier and transform the unreasonable industrial imbalance between coastal and inland areas. Provincial and municipal officials then ordered individual work units to hold meetings and urged laborers to enthusiastically throw themselves into the battle of inland construction and think of the interior as their home. According to Shanghai propaganda guidelines, recruits were told that China's industrial battlefront had entered a new stage of development. This period of adjustment after the Great Leap Forward was over, and industrial and agricultural production were surging ahead. And yet, China's industrial layout was unreasonable because imperialism had concentrated industry on the coast. The Third Front would fix this problem by industrializing the interior. Since Shanghai was one of China's most important industrial bases, it had a responsibility to fully support inland construction. Developing the interior was also necessary because American imperialism was incessantly plotting to overthrow China's socialist system and stage a capitalist restoration. Third Front recruits had to carry forward the revolutionary tradition of being ready to realize one's aspirations anywhere in the country. People might be reluctant to leave family, but which of China's revolutionary martyrs did not have parents, a wife, or kids? Now our country is like one big family, and each individual ought to ardently love our big family's revolutionary mission and struggle to build up our country. Before someone was transferred to a Third Front project, a political background check was conducted to ensure that they are not classified as a landlord, rich peasant, counter-revolutionary, or rightist, and that they did not have any foreign contacts or personal reason to oppose the party. The CCP instituted these recruitment criteria because it sought to only enlist people that could be trusted to remain dedicated to Third Front construction amid hardships and who would not disclose its existence to domestic or foreign enemies. With this framing, the Communist Party presented Third Front participation as a political privilege. Some participants were excited to have this opportunity to link their personal lives to the larger political project of strengthening China's industrial fences and going where the party leadership thought that they were most needed. Some participants' enthusiasm was heightened by Mao's declaration that until the Third Front was built, we would not sleep well. Favorable views of this sort were more common among youth who had grown up after the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, and party members whose personal biographies were already deeply enmeshed with the CCP's project of building and defending socialism in China. Longtime party member and vice director of the Southwest Third Front Commission, Chiang Kai-shek, who you can see in this picture here on the left with Deng Xiaoping and Li Jingquan, the longtime party secretary of Sichuan. Chiang Kai-shek thought, and he has in his memoirs, that preparing for war was absolutely necessary because America had launched a war of aggression against Vietnam and the Soviet border was very tense. In addition, the Third Front helped rectify the lack of industry in the interior. Chiang viewed building the Third Front as part of his lifelong mission of constructing Chinese socialism. Chiang's long revolutionary career is evident in a 1964 speech in which he called on his fellow Third Front administrators to remember when during the War of Resistance against Japan, we pulled out of Yunnan and endured lots of difficulties. The Third Front required the same spirit that the party had then. Chiang's career as an administrator is also displayed on his 1964 speech. Chiang treats the Third Front as a technical matter of correct bureaucratic procedures and structures, and he describes redesigning the economic makeup of Southwest China and relocating hundreds of thousands of people as quote unquote administrative tasks. According to Chiang, one task all party leaders were committed to was not squeezing agriculture like they had during the Great Leap. As for rank and file recruits, many were traumatized to learn that they had been chosen to answer Mao's order to firm up national security by industrializing remote mountainous areas. Urban residents were particularly distressed since going to the Third Front amounted to a socioeconomic step down. When some people learned about relocation, they didn't eat and couldn't sleep. Some cried, some complained. Instead of living in a city in China's industrial heartland, they would have to reside not just in the underdeveloped interior, but in its mountainous hinterlands. Workers were very anxious about the sort of life that awaited them in this industrial world that they would have to build themselves. Questions raced through their minds in a frenetic pace about their own and families' uncertain future. What sort of housing, medical facilities, and cultural activities would there be at the Third Front? Would there be schools for their children? And if there were, would they be any good? What would local weather and food be like? And would they be able to adapt? Would they be able to understand the local dialect? Or would they be left feeling lost in translation? And probably most importantly, would they be able to come back and live again with their family and friends? Administrators charged with overseeing the relocation of urban workers had their own concerns too. Some provincial officials shared the worry of those in the party center who thought that the Third Front might negatively impact the countryside like the Great Leap had. And so they stressed that the campaign must be centrally directed and that agriculture must receive adequate consideration. Some Northeastern coastal officials also cautioned against ignoring the development of their regions and devoting too much attention to the interior. While some inland provincials voiced similar words of warning, others sought to acquire more industrial resources from developed parts of the country to advance local industrialization. Officials in rural areas also tended to view the Third Front more positively because it was a way for them to gain more resources by temporarily hiring out labor to projects in their vicinity. Employed in this way, a worker could earn about 32 yuan per month. The laborer's wage, however, did not directly go into their pocket. The rural unit first took a portion to cover the cost of food and lodging. Workers received the remainder, which was often about 6 yuan. This sum was a significant material benefit for rural folk who were typically compensated in work points and earned on average 11 to 15 yuan per year. The amount that rural officials skimmed off the top was also more than they usually spent on labor's livelihood, meaning that they too earned extra funding. The small number of rural residents hired as permanent employees accrued the even greater privilege of having access to the broad welfare guarantees of an urban state-owned enterprise. Despite these material advantages, some rural parents were still reluctant to let their children partake in the Third Front because they preferred to have more familial labor for their household could not bear to part with their loved ones, and feared that they might be maimed or killed in an accident. As this overview of people's responses to Third Front recruitment demonstrates, how people thought and felt about being integrated into China's covert Cold War industrial defense apparatus was shaped by their specific social, economic, and geographical situation. When it comes to Shanghai officials, they were of at least two minds about sending local labor to the Third Front. The Mississippi declared that whatever the Third Front needs, we should move. Shanghai's vice mayor was more reserved. In a letter to the State Planning Commission, he cautioned against not fully using the First Front, especially disagreed with the new policy of not approving any new things being done in the First Front, since developing the coast would increase labor productivity, lower costs, and raise profits. It's likely that officials in other big coastal and northeastern cities viewed mobilizing local labor and resources for the Third Front with similar ambivalence. For urban residents, their departure for the Third Front was often filled with tears. Leading cadres tried to stimulate enthusiasm by playing revolutionary songs and coming to the train station to wish them farewell. These efforts at solicitude were usually of little avail, as family members and workers both welled up at not knowing if ever they would be able to see each other again. The hundreds of thousands of kilometers they had to travel before arriving at their destination reinforced the feeling of how far from home they were going. Their sense of heading out into the middle of nowhere was further enhanced by the fact that their future workplace was usually only reachable by trucks that had to snake for hours, if not days, deep into dusty mountains. Although rural folk generally had to travel shorter distances, they rarely had the luxury of motorized transport and had to instead walk for tens to hundreds of kilometers along rugged mountain routes. Upon reaching their new workplace, many recruits were shocked to find not an established factory, but a construction site in various stages of completion. Due to shortages of motor vehicles, recruits regularly had to install heavy machinery by hand and lug in literally tons of supplies on shoulder poles and push carts. Whatever sort of work people were engaged in, it was militarized. People were organized into military units. Administrators described project goals as battles in China's struggle against the United States and Soviet Union. Militaristic language and routines pervaded everyday life, from calling colleagues comrades in arms to a regimented schedule of morning calisthenics, long work hours, and irregular readings of Mao's works about the need to have a military mindset. To reach the new Third Front town, Panzhihua, recruits took a 5-day ride in the back of trucks up into the soaring peaks of southern Sichuan, camping at night along dusty roadsides. Upon arriving in town, people were assigned to labor brigades charged with building Panzhihua's industrial infrastructure. One labor brigade was assigned to excavate by hand a 12-meter high boulder. To motivate workers, propaganda teams played songs and staged performances about locals working for days on end. So the Third Front was built, and Chairman Mao slept well. In 1966, Vice Premier Peng Zhen came to Panzhihua and warned that people cannot always work and must be allowed to sleep 8 hours. He also exalted local truck drivers whose habit of not sleeping and eating to get equipment quickly into town exemplified the will to ceaseless work that Peng had just cautioned against. Local officials also took Peng's visit as a reason to use the fastest pace to complete the mission Chairman Mao has given us. After work, the earliest recruits were lucky if they slept in tents on thin mats, as many closed their eyes under the stars with no bedding at all. Even when laborers erected housing, it typically consisted of a thatched hut made from rammed earth. Provisions were similarly Spartan, with water scoured from local streams, and rice, porridge, pickled vegetables being the main source of sustenance. Fresh vegetables occasionally added as an accompaniment, and small morsels of meat only served once a month. This regime of austerity was by design, resulting from the party's policy of restraining consumption so that more resources were available for expanding China's heavy industrial infrastructure and increasing its output. Workers in Panzhihua came up with a jingle to sum up the resultant austerity of everyday Maoism. During the daytime, steel bars pressed down on our shoulders, and at night, we pressed down on hard beds. Another doggerel that workers came up with to describe their daily routine was, during the daytime is a barrel of laughs, and at night we miss home. Third Front officials were aware of worker discontent, and so they made sure that participants were provided with a steady diet of films. They also distributed musical instruments and organized cultural performances and sporting events. One reason that Third Front administrators paid attention to local cultural life was that the labor force was predominantly male. This demographic fact meant that for many singles, an assignment to the Third Front was a long-term sentence to celibacy. When interviewees discussed the Third Front's gender imbalance, they stated that one consequence was sexual violence. In interviews, people talked about the hardships of Third Front life in many different ways, but there was a clear split in perspectives along the urban-rural divide. People from rural areas generally thought that Third Front was better than the countryside, since as SOA employees, they had higher wages and access to welfare benefits. Urban recruits, on the other hand, sometimes said that they had no choice but to stay, since if they left, they would lose their membership in an urban work unit and its associated welfare guarantees. Although many urbanites wish they could have lived elsewhere, some also noted that their hardships had paid off. For years, they had engaged in physically demanding tasks, and in the end, they had industrialized a wasteland. Other laborers worked hard because they enjoyed putting to use their technical abilities. One university graduate was not satisfied when he was assigned to a construction team. Later, he found a sense of self-worth as a manager of a chemical factory. Another university graduate was assigned to a coal mine. From this experience, he had not developed a devout attachment to socialism. He had learned that there was no difference between socialism and Buddhism because socialism provided with so little that they came to accept that it was pointless to want anything. Despite his dire realism, this man, like many others, enjoyed free movie screenings almost every night. Yet many people still thought that life at the Third Front was dull. Some people found it especially tedious constantly studying Mao's speeches, which one interviewee compared to their bland diet of steamed beans and dried turnip stew. Some work units tried to deal with the monotony of daily life by increasing film showings and holding sports competitions. Nonetheless, many reviewers still complained that the Third Front was boring, a comment that has led me to come up with the dry joke that building socialism was boring. What many people wanted was family far away. At first, some projects only allowed urban families to move to nearby villages so that material resources became concentrated on industrial construction. Aware that family separation was a pressing issue, the CCP permitted 12 days of paid leave. This policy's impact was significant. For example, at Panjwai Steel, on any given day, around a tenth of employees were on vacation. Administrators wanted laborers to spend more time at work, and so it relocated rural families to factory-run farms and provided service sector jobs for urban families. To handle the influx of worker kin, Panjwai Steel constructed new brick buildings and more tents and mud huts. Better housing did not change much the conjugal life of single rural men, since most single women came from cities and did not want to marry a country bumpkin. Families had other worries. Many parents worried that poor schools would cripple their children's life trajectory, and so parents helped run local schools. Even though the CCP suspended university exams for most of the 1970s, some parents still dreamed that their children might go to college in a less insular part of China. Urbanites had sacrificed their own biography to fortify Cold War China's military industrial ramparts, but they did not want to also give their children's lives to the Third Front. To assess the afterlives of the Third Front, it is necessary to examine this issue from several different angles. If this topic is approached from the perspective of the workers themselves, the picture is decidedly ambivalent. While the Third Fronters regularly recognize in their memoirs and oral interviews that their years of hard work endowed inland China with a larger industrial base, they also often complain about the material privation of their everyday lives and the psychological adversity of being separated from family and friends. Even if family members accompany recruits, they frequently worried that their work units' subpar schools would adversely impact their children's life chances, and perhaps even make their progeny suffer the same bureaucratic fate as themselves and have to reside forever in China's mountainous backwoods. If a different perspective is adopted and the Third Front is evaluated through the lens of its economic results, they too are unmistakably mixed. From one perspective, the Third Front made significant contributions to the development of inland China. By building up regional industrial infrastructure, the Third Front integrated inland regions more into the Chinese economy, sped up the circulation of regional resources, and augmented manufacturing, mining, and power facilities that made a society fueled by hydrocarbons and electricity into more of an economic norm in inland China. Taken all together, these economic changes help to decrease the economic gap between the coast and the interior. On the other hand, they also established an industrial base whose continued growth would require ever more resources and whose development would place ever more stress on China's ecology. From another standpoint, the Third Front was massively wasteful. According to a 1984 State Council report, only 48% of all projects were worthy of further development. The other 52% were abandoned. This statistic is a stunning testament of how much of the Third Front passed into the dustbin of Chinese economic history. However, when considering the inefficiency of the Third Front, it is important to take into account the security logics embedded in its construction. According to party policy, Third Front projects had to be in secluded mountains, put them out of sight of enemy bombers. About a quarter of funding was also invested in factories that manufactured war materials. And projects were rushed because of concerns that the Soviet Union or United States might soon execute a major attack. This policy of quickening the building process ironically slowed down project completion as it resulted in shoddy construction and the need for years of repair, which in turn raised building costs. Given the Third Front's many economic problems, it might seem most appropriate to conclude that despite what it left in terms of industrial infrastructure, it must overall be viewed as an economic failure. This viewpoint, however, overlooks the fact that Third Front was a development initiative which placed ensuring national defense as the top priority. Critics might still object that although certain inefficiencies are to be expected for an industrial defense project, the CCP leadership nevertheless still overreacted to Soviet and American military pressures by investing so much in the Third Front, and that the party could have guaranteed China's security with a more moderate industrial campaign. Perhaps the Third Front was too much, but stopping our analysis there neglects to take on board one particularly important point. The Third Front was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a slew of defense initiatives undertaken by Washington and Moscow during the Cold War, from the thousands of atomic bombs produced that, if used, would have annihilated life on Earth many times over, to the very long, bloody, and costly wars fought in Vietnam and Afghanistan. From this standpoint, the excessiveness of the Third Front appears not as a Chinese anomaly, but rather as part and parcel of the irrationality of great power competition during the Cold War, when massive reactions to perceived national security threats became a defining feature of international statecraft. This is a point especially worth remembering today, as talk of a new Cold War between China and the United States is becoming more and more normal every single day. All right, thank you for being here, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, Cole, thank you so much for giving us such a wonderful overview of your book. So, as I said, we now have some time for questions and answers. So, if any of you in the audience have questions, please just submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out. So maybe I can start us off, and what I wanted to ask about in the first place is that I think anyone who has read the book will see that see or be very impressed by the wide range of sources that you used. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit about the sources that you used to research this monograph, and also maybe a bit about the oral history that you did for the book, because I think that's also sort of a very interesting aspect of the work.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a wide variety of sources I used because I basically just was a scavenger of trying to get any sort of sources I could get my hands on. The book definitely has benefited from sort of a boom in Third Front studies and Third Front memoir literature in China over the last decade or so. And this is partially due to the fact that the Third Front is viewed by the party as a positive legacy of the Mao era. And so my suspicion is what has happened is that there's money given to local party offices or given to engage in sort of cultural activities and history projects to produce things. And this is one thing that they can talk about is the local and developmental history and sort of the Third Front's contribution to economic development. And so this has led to a lot of memoirs that have been produced, especially in the last decade or so, which form a lot of the book. It comes from that. In terms of documents, documents were always tricky. Initially, I told people what I studied when I went to China because I was just young and dumb and inexperienced. And I learned quickly not to tell people what I study, because if you tell them you studied the Third Front, if they know what that is, which is, surprisingly, most people don't know what it is still in China. So when I went first to Chongqing, the archivist had no idea what the Third Front was, even though the Chongqing was a major recipient of it, but it just shows how the secret logic behind it worked. But eventually they found out what it was, or somebody told them, and then they clamped down and were very restrictive on what I could see. And so what I started to do later on was just tell places that I was interested in economic development. If that didn't work because it was too vague, then I would say various economic sectors, so railroads and dams, because what I decided to do after some difficulties was just focus on bigger projects. Some of the memoirs I could get from smaller projects, because local counties had produced things, produced memoirs, or local cities too. But a lot of it was sort of big projects, so railroads, dams, electrical grids, big cities that were made. They tended to. My reasoning was they were going to generate a lot of paper, because they basically existed because of the Third Front. And a lot of paper was going to be generated in the process of carrying out this project, and people would involved in it would probably want to talk about it because sort of it was a monumental project contributing to national development. And I was largely right there. So that was helpful for collecting some stuff. But then also with documents, that I did a similar sort of thing of trying to research specific industries. It was the way I would approach it with archives. And so most of the archival stuff is from Sichuan and Hubei, and then there's some that came from Shanghai through the assistance of a graduate student in China who helped actually collect the materials. For the oral history, that was really just the snowball method. So there was a couple ways that worked in terms of finding people. One was I had some friends who were popular on Weibo. So when Weibo was popular 10 years ago, we were popular on Weibo. And so before I would go to a town, they would sort of announce I was coming and ask if anybody knew anything about the Third Front and wanted to show me around. And so that helped make some initial contacts. And then I also we used to search Weibo posts. So I would search for like Sanxian and Huiyi or something like that, or some sort of thing that indicated that these people knew what the Third Front was and they lived in these towns. And then I would just cold call them or cold DM them and see if they were willing to talk to me. And so that sort of got me a handful of people to talk to. And then people usually wanted to talk about this if they had been involved in it. Some of them were skittish because I was a foreigner, but otherwise people were usually interested in having their stories heard.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. So we have our first few questions. To start off, we have two questions from Gina Marchetti, our colleague here at HKU. And she asks, firstly, whether you could say a bit about the impact of the Cultural Revolution on conditions among the workers on the Third Front. And her second question is whether you've looked at any of the recent films dealing with the Third Front, such as Jia Zhangke's 24 City.
Okay, so for the impact of the Cultural Revolution, let me just take a few notes so I make sure I get everything in here. So there's a couple of things that happened with the Cultural Revolution that immediately come to mind. One is that you got factional struggles. So like everywhere else in China, you got factional struggles between different groups. And these were somewhat contained in really top priority projects. So the nuclear industry was more protected. Some airplane factories and other places were more protected from factional struggles than elsewhere. Third Front towns, the people will like to say that they're more protected from the from the Cultural Revolution factional struggles than other places. I'm not sure how true this is. So just to give one example, Panzhihua is a place I studied extensively. It's a steel town in southwest China at the bottom of Sichuan. And there I was reading a memoir, and This guy was talking, he was a local leader. He was talking for a long time about how he was involved in building railroads, building local infrastructure. And then randomly, all of a sudden, and also how this area had not been affected by the Cultural Revolution that much. But then randomly in one of he sort of mentions, oh yes, and I was beat up by Red Guards and I'm blind in one eye now. And then he sort of said, oh, but everything was good. And then he just sort of moves on. So you kind of have to take with a grain of salt the talk about factional struggles not impacting them, because I think it's somewhat of a trope of the time period for the Third Front people. So there's that aspect. Also, factional struggles, another thing that you can see is, like elsewhere, these get to be instrumentalized, the language of the Maoist period, and that Maoist ideas get used for all sorts of things. There's some people, so some people leave the Third Front and go back to Shanghai is where I have the most information about them. And they went back to Shanghai and they said, it was the capitalist roaders who sent us. Therefore, we should not have to go back to the Third Front. Or they say, it was other people who were building railroads. They say, the administrators say, oh, because we need to struggle to make Mao sleep well, you guys need to work more and not eat as much and have longer work hours. Then some of the kitchen staff say, oh, actually, if you read Mao's writings, what it means is we need to have more dumplings and more food. So the language of Maoism gets really instrumentalized for all sorts of different sort of purposes as part of people's factional struggles, but also people's just personal interests, personal pursuits. One other big impact you can see of the Cultural Revolution is just how technical and administrative personnel are treated. So one thing that happens is that because of Cultural Revolution ideology, or just Maoist ideology writ large, on the attacks on the bourgeoisie and as being something foreign, technical administrative elites as being something foreign and something that's of the enemy. So it's either American, it's tagged as being American, or it's being tagged as linked somehow to the Soviet Union. This means that they're and there's a different sort of version of what you're supposed to do with technique and administration, which is mass mobilization of people and paying more attention to organic intellectuals, or paying more attention to workers and their views on how you should build things and use technology and the new technology you should create. And so this leads to mass mobilization of people to build stuff, but it also leads to attacks on administrative and technical personnel, which leads to a whole bunch of just shoddy construction, because some things you can build quickly and it will still work. There's other things that don't require as much precision. So if you look at the recent work of Sigrid Smelter, some of her stuff about agriculture, it has a very sort of positive take on sort of this mass mobilization of labor for research and for agricultural science. I have sort of a more negative take on this. If you look at things like dams or airplanes or steel factories, they have to be very precise, and it takes a lot of knowledge and experience and skill to be able to do these things. And so with the Third Front, a lot of stuff is built quickly and badly. So, and then the last question about films. I've looked somewhat at the films. I've thought at one point about writing an article about the films and the TV shows. I haven't done that for a couple of reasons. One is because I've been doing the Third Front for 10 years, and so I want to do something else. The other reason is because there's a James Dawson at the University of Cambridge is writing a thesis on sort of Third Front memory culture and cultural production. And so that's his domain, not mine. But one thing I will say about 24 City, though, is that film, when I initially saw it, it was one of the first things I saw about the Third Front, and I actually really liked it. But when I knew more about the Third Front, I thought that movie was somewhat disingenuous, because what the movie story really tells is the story of industrial failure. So it's all these factories that go bankrupt and all these people that get abandoned because the factory goes bankrupt. The factory that he's talking about, that's what happens to some of the people, but and there's definitely that is part of the story. But that factory also becomes Chengdu Aircraft Corporation, which is one of the premier producers of China's fighter jets. So the things that people worry about now that fly over Taiwan into the air defense zone, those come from the third front factories, at least some of them do. So yeah, I think that he's a little bit disingenuous in the way that he portrays the factory, and that he just portrays it as a failure. But actually, if you go down to downtown Chengdu and you see this walled off area for the Chengdu Aircraft Corporation, that's another part of the 24th city moved to there. And it's very important for China's military industrial complex today. All right, any other questions?
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Xie Chuning. And the question is, could you talk more about the everyday life for the relocated population in the Third Front projects? I myself am a product of the Third Front. Growing up in Xi'an, everybody spoke standardized Mandarin. I learned no dialect at all. So there's definitely a sense of lack of belonging to a place that could be called a hometown.
Yeah. So, I mean, what happened with Third Front, there's a lot of stuff to say about sort of the everyday life of relocated people, but to speak to the specific issue you just raised, this is something that I noticed, is that because Third Front towns are basically immigrants cities, what happens is that Mandarin takes on a sort of different sort of currency, because it's the way for people from all sorts of different areas to converse. So for a factory, you might have maybe half the factory is from Shanghai, but then you'll have other people who came from Shenyang, you have some other people who are maybe from Chengdu, you have other people who are from the local countryside, and these people have very, very different dialects and very different versions of what Chinese is, and a lot of them are mutually incomprehensible to each other. And so Mandarin became really Putonghua, it became the thing that the currency for people to communicate amongst each other, but also for the youth, it's interesting that they mentioned for the youth, there's a sort of sense of not belonging, but for the older generation, at least what happened with some people is you really got language communities. So there were the Shanghainese hung out with the other Shanghainese, the people who are from Guangdong hung out with the other people from Guangdong, the people who are from the Northeast or different parts of the Northeast, they all hung out together, and they maintained their language, just like other immigrant communities in other parts of the world. They also maintained their eating practices as much as they could. So places that were closer to big cities, so places that, so Shanghai had a small Third Front in Anhui and sort of the surrounding provinces, it was easier for them to maintain some of their cultural practices that signified them as from being from Shanghai, because they could go back regularly and people went back regularly. If you got sent far inland to a place like Xi'an, and I don't know where the person who asked the questions was from, but if you're from further away, it's harder to maintain that sense of sort of diasporic identity. Yeah, thank you.
The next question comes from Xu Jing. So the question, it says, thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. Could you further share some thoughts about the long-term political impact of the Third Front, especially on individuals? Will those once exposed to this project contact government more actively nowadays, since they were used to depend on the work unit or the government?
Okay. So there are definitely there's different levels to this, but for people who were very reliant on the welfare unit and then lost the welfare unit, yes, there's definitely people who are still trying to get their pensions raised. There's been long struggles over raising pensions. Mark Fraser at the New School has looked a little bit at this, sort of the long-term struggles that people have had over this issue. Some of the people who are actually still really involved in creating Third Front memoirs are actually involved in this movement to try to get it so that either they have pensions or their pensions become stronger. You also have railroad workers who have done this as well to try to get it so that they get money later on for injuries that they suffered while they were working, or to get their pensions who were raised. But for the Third Front, it really depends on who you're talking about. That's sort of the people who stayed at the projects and then didn't promote out. So there's a number of people who came in and then cycled out of the project. So if you're, for example, a designer of factories, the designer of a factory might come from an urban design unit in Chengdu come in, design the factory, and then leave. Those people, I haven't been able to track them, but those people I suspect were able to use their skills post 78 to and parlay them into new jobs. Even people who were in lower level jobs within the Third Front, you can see that they were able to use their administrative skills or the technical skills that they had and parlay them into jobs later on. The people who had much more difficulty with that was just people who didn't have a high educational level and then didn't have particularly specialized technical skills that they could transfer into something else later on. And one last point on that is that another thing you can see, Tamo Zhou is doing more work on this actually, but one thing that you can also see is it mattered when you left the Third Front. So this is something you'll hear sometimes from people who are in the Third Front who stayed behind, meaning they stayed in Sichuan and didn't move back to Shanghai. Some of the older people, they'll talk about how if I had Shanghai'd and if I jumped into the ocean or jumped into the sea, the expression that people have for leaving the welfare unit and going into the market. If I had done this in the 1980s, then my life would have been different. And you can see this with people who left early on and went to Shanghai and got a job there, and versus people who stayed in Sichuan and didn't leave. It really affected their trajectory when they decided to leave the Third Front.
Interesting. Yeah. The next question comes from Dennis DeBell. And he says, thank you for the great book, blog, and talk. I think he's talking about your everyday life in Maoist China blog, which people should have a look at, definitely. He says, my question in relation to the long-term legacy of the Third Front construction. So after opening up and the movement towards the coastal areas, the special economic zones, there seems to be movement back towards the hinterland again today. For example, high-tech developments in Guizhou. So what is the current status of rural hinterland developments today, and how does it practically relate to the Third Front movement?
Okay, so in terms of the economic legacies, as I mentioned during the talk, it's really mixed, but the things that do last are really infrastructure and then some high-tech places. Those are the easiest things to see. I think there's other legacies as well, but those are sort of the easiest things. So big things like if there was a large deposit of coal in Liupanshui and Guizhou, it's still there. And so it's still generating wealth. And it's still something that is integral to the economy of Guizhou. Or the railroads, those are still there. The roads, the electrical lines, so a lot of this stuff, the basic infrastructure is there. And this really gets built into Western, sort of central China, we'll say, if you take Tibet and Xinjiang off, because there's not really much Third Front stuff there, but the central part of China, it's really thanks to the Third Front that this area gets a lot of basic industrial infrastructure and it expands. And that's something that has probably been updated since then, but really the core of it comes out of the Third Front. This is when most of that investment happens. In terms of high tech, the thing that happens from the 80s into the 90s onwards is that a lot of the factories that had been up in the mountains, especially the high tech places, they didn't get abandoned completely. What happened is some of them stayed up in the mountains, part of it, and then the rest went to the provincial capital. So what you would expect normally to happen with investment is it goes to the area that it is the major attraction for capital and just resources. And so they went to provincial capitals or they went to third tier cities. So a lot of third tier cities like Zhuani and Guizhou, or places like Zhejiang in Sichuan. These places, their sort of high-tech and industrial base came out of the Third Front. That was the only thing that came out of, but that was really the foundation for a lot of it. And so there you definitely have those still existing and still attracting investment. The big difference, though, now I think compared to the Third Front time period is at least two things. One is that before, China wanted to hide everything because they were afraid they were going to get invaded. Now China's in a very different economic, and also you're building basic industrial infrastructure. Now what China is trying to do is build itself into the global economy. And so the third, continuing developments on inland areas is part of that, in that it's about connecting Western China to Central Asia, connecting it to Southeast Asia, connecting it even further, through other transport routes into Africa and into Europe. So this is a very different China, and also very in terms of its ambitions and goals, but also just its capabilities. A lot of the technology that you look at that gets used for the Third Front is from the Soviet Union, or it's even from the 30s. It's stuff that gets imported then. The technology transfer happens then, and then it just gets imported, gets shifted from Shanghai, the same technology inland, same stuff from the Northeast going inland. But these are sort of 1930s technologies. Now China is more in a leading position of transferring its technology and being much higher up on the global value chain, and that's the goal compared to what you had before.
All right, thanks. The next question comes from Angie Becker here at HKU. So she says, thanks for this talk. I'm wondering about the structural and cultural legacies of the Third Front today in terms of how the military is integrated into the fabric of society. So could you talk a bit about the Third Front's legacy in terms of shifts in the country's approach to development and modernization and the industrial military complexes of China today? Which industries today are more directly connected to this legacy?
Okay. So it depends on what you're talking about. So before, with the Mao era, everything was militarized. Really 60s and 70s, most of the Chinese economy is militarized, either in terms of actually being directly related to the military or controlled by the military, or just a generalized militarization of society in terms of the language, in terms of organization that occurs really in the 1960s and 70s most prominently. You have it some in the 50s, but 60s and 70s most prominently. For me, the biggest shift that happens really is the demilitarization of Chinese socialism in sort of over the course of the 1970s into the 1980s. And this has a couple of consequences. One is it's really, with the Third Front, it's the end of the Maoist developmental model of just mass mobilizing labor in these huge military regiments. They're not formally military, but militia, sometimes, other times just militarized language, militarized organization, to build huge amounts of infrastructure. This starts with the Great Leap Forward, and then you have two other big bursts with the Third Front in 1964 to 1966, and then 1969 to 1971. So after the Third Front is sort of phased out over the course of the 1970s, this militarized mode of just development with massive inputs of labor and resources goes away. Another thing that goes important with this going away is the rise of the technocrat as being something that's valued and emulated, worthy of emulation and worthy of developing for the country. And so you really see this from the 70s forward as a shift away from the Maoist developmental policies towards a different version of what Chinese economic development is going to look like. Another part of this big shift is just the role of consumption. During the Mao era, consumption is heavily suppressed because what's most valued is heavy industry, and heavy industry is valued because it's going to protect the country, either protecting the country by having a bigger economic base, or it's going to protect the country because heavy industry is what's needed for modern warfare. There's a shift with what consumption means once you move into the 1970s, into the 1980s, and this is something that it's part of being a consumption citizen, having higher standards of living, having higher consumer standards, just consuming more. This is something that becomes valued from sort of late 70s forward, and you just get it's part of the demilitarization of Chinese society is how you get this shift. So that's sort of the bigger picture in terms of the actual industries that are connected to the Third Front. So that are still directly connected to the military, to respond to your specific question. There, it's sort of the usual subjects, it's nuclear, it's airplanes, it's aerospace, it's weaponry. That stuff is still directly connected to the military. All this stuff before that would have been militarized, because of the Mao era, just everything becomes securitized. The whole economy becomes securitized. Those things are no longer connected to the military So yeah, I mean, some of them have some connections, but it's not at all the same as before.
All right, thank you. We've got another question from Gina Marchetti. She says, could you say more about the conditions faced by women workers? She says she was struck in particular by a mention of sexual violence. How common was this, and how were instances of sexual misconduct handled?
Yeah, so I can say a little bit about the conditions first. So with the conditions, there were less women than elsewhere, than men in most of these work units, partially because the Third Front slanted towards heavy industry, and heavy industry tended to be men would be the primary workers there. And so these towns or the factories would often be slanted towards a more male population. Women, women were brought in intentionally. The party served as really a matchmaker in a lot of ways. The party did this before. They'd done it in Xinjiang. They'd done it in other places as well, of sort of sending in a lot of men and then realizing, oh, men without women causes lots of problems. They start fighting with each other. They just get disgruntled. They want to go home. They don't like it there. And so what happens in the case of the Third Front is a couple things. One, women are brought in by pairing factories. So for example, if you built a bolt factory, right? A factory that makes bolts. Then next to it, you have a textile factory, because textile factories tended to have more women at them. And so this was one way of solving this problem. Another thing that was done was bringing in children of Third Front workers. So you might have the husband moved with the wife, but the kids were somewhere else. Their kids would have brought in as a way to sort of solve some of this demographic issue. Another thing that was done was sent down youth. So sent down youth within the province or within the county were brought in also to deal with this demographic issues. In terms of the issue of sexual violence, this is just something that I've heard come up. This is something that people has mentioned, but it isn't something that I know a whole lot about. So this also shows up in movies too. So Wang Xiaoshuai has a couple of movies about the Third Front. I think in at least one or two of his movies, there's a rape. And it's something that the first time I heard about it was talking to a policeman at one of the Third Front work units. And when I just asked him, what were some of the common crimes, and rape was what he mentioned. But I didn't feel comfortable asking more about this because it seemed like a touchy subject. And then also, as I say in the book, my interlocutors in terms of interviews are mainly men. This happened partially because when I talked to Third Front workers, occasionally their wives would be there, but the women tended to be used to sort of deferring to their husbands and just letting their husbands hold court and lead the conversation. And so women often, I usually couldn't get women's voices. Even if I would ask them questions, their husbands would just talk anyways. I had some help with this with my wife, who would, in some instances, talk with the women sort of separately, and I would talk to the man, and that would kind of help. But that was only in sort of rare occasions. So yeah, it's something I'd like to know more about, but I just don't know.
All right, thanks. So maybe a final question, as we're almost running out of time. That comes from Ruslan Yusupov from CUHK, and he says, thank you. The concept of front is so important for and recurrent in Chinese politics. I wonder if you see any continuities and changes in the definitions of front in the history of the PRC.
Okay. So yes, there's definitely, in terms of changes or continuities of the fronts. Well, I think that a lot of this language comes out of just the revolutionary base areas. This is where sort of the cauldron of formation of Chinese communist language comes out of. And so this militarized language that gets really built into the party early on, because Mao and others are fighting for most of the first 20 or 30 years of their existence as the Communist Party. So you get this heavily militarized language that's built in, and front is one of the ideas that comes out of this. This is something you can still see in Chinese slogans today. I think there's a couple big differences, though, in terms of how it got used then and versus now. One is just China's understanding of itself, its position in the world, and also its capabilities. So if you look at the way that the Third Front was organized, it's organized. It's a strategy of weakness. They are afraid they're going to get invaded, and so how do they deal with invasion? They militarize the whole entire country, and there's third fronts everywhere. So there's the first front on the coast, then there's another front, there's another second front in the central, sort of right behind the coast, and then there's the third front even deeper in. So, but that's just one level. There's also these small third fronts, so that in all of the provinces, there's also these military industrial complexes, which are largely based where former revolutionary base areas are set up all over the place. And it's because they're afraid that they can't deal with airplanes. They have no Navy. They don't have any way to stop a nuclear attack. And so this is a very different version of what a front means, and that the whole society is militarized. People didn't realize this. People didn't understand, I don't think, really what the military strategy was. People knew that guerrilla warfare was the plan if they got invaded, but I don't think they understood how this front strategy was going to play out. Now, China still has this fear of penetration by foreigners, but it's much different, and that it's really focused on the periphery. It's focused on Xinjiang, it's focused on Tibet, it's focused on Taiwan, Hong Kong. Really the sort of the edges of the country, not the interior of the country, and this is due, I think, to a significant degree to just China's capacities. Now, China has a nuclear deterrent. They don't have as many nuclear weapons as the United States, but they do have a lot, and they can hit most major players. And so this gives them a much stronger sense of security. They also have airplanes. They have tanks. They actually have a Navy that goes all over the world. And so they're in a much different military position. And so the actual idea of what a military front is no longer really the interior of the country. It's getting stretched even further and further throughout the world with the party. Tim Winter is a person who's looked at this sort of stuff of creating a new sense of what the nation is, so that the nation is no longer just Chinese territory, but the nation could be Djibouti, with the base there. The nation could be workers involved in oil work in Libya. The nation can be all over the world now, and so the idea of what needs to be securitized and protected is dramatically expanded with the globalization of Chinese industry over the last 20 years or so.
All right, thank you very much for that as well. All right, so yes, so we've already run out of time. So I'd like once again to thank you, Covell, for taking the time to speak to us about your book, give us this such a wonderful talk, and also so patiently answer all these questions. Before I conclude things, I should point out that the Chinese Business History webinar's next session will be on the 12th of November, when we will have Dr. Peter Hamilton from Lingnan University, and he will talk about the introduction of scientific business management in Republican China. So we'll go back in time a bit. But once again, Cole, thanks so much for giving us this talk, and thanks to all of you for tuning in and listening. And I hope to see many of you at the next talk in 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much to everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for all the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.